Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Kundal Breakfast Briefing. For those of you who haven't attended one of these briefings before, they're an event that we run periodically to share knowledge with clients, collaborators, and industry peers around particular topics that we think are relevant to the industry. So this is a recording of our breakfast briefing from the 13th of June, which was about the use of data and data-driven design in urban master planning and how that's essential to drive sustainable solutions within that field. We've got some fantastic presenters for this particular event who I'm going to introduce now. So my name is Andrew Jackson. I'm a partner within the London Building Services team, and I also head up Kundal's Global Major Projects Group. We've got Stephen Fry-Harris, who's an associate director in our ITAV team, and he's also our global lead on smart cities and smart buildings. We've got Dr. Elisabeth Marlow, who's an expert in designing resilient cities and is also vice president for the IStructE's UK and Europe region. And we've got Athanasios Liaskonis, who is a civil engineer in our Newcastle office and is also our lead on flooding and a very talented engineer. So going on to what we're going to talk to you about today, we've got a quick overview of the topics for you. So the first one is about the use of big data, which in this case is so big that it's massive data. And then we're going to talk about three specific fields which are relevant to master planning. The first one being food, the second being flood, and the third one being flea. So with all of that said, I'm going to hand you over to the first presenter, who is Stephen Fry-Harris. So Stephen, please take it away.
Thank you, Andrew. Delighted to talk to you about massive data and how we go and approach this on an urban master planning scale. So the first challenge that we have is the way in which data is presented. So we have a whole host of different international standards, different bodies and organizations that have come together to look at analyzing urban master planning in different methodologies. So we've mapped this across to demonstrate the numbers that we're dealing with, and this amounts to over 1,000 different indicators, different ways in which we go and measure an approach to urban master planning. So how we use land, how many doctors that we have in an area, our different smart metrics in terms of broadband connectivity, flooding and resilience, food availability. And this potentially can become quite overawing. It's a large number of different metrics that we go and use to analyze a smart city, a smart development, and not forgetting that this is underpinned by a huge amount of data. We are looking at 90% of the data that we have at the moment being produced over the last 10 to 20 years. We currently have terabytes and terabytes of data for cities. This effectively can measure to the moon and back 10,000 times if we printed this on A4. So this is a huge amount of data, a huge amount of indicators, and potentially can become quite overawing. So the way we go and approach this is to look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This provides our golden thread. This is the element that links all of these different indicators together and really underpins how we can go and approach this. These are the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that virtually all countries are signed up to. And this provides the opportunity for us to go and push and pull all of these different metrics, all of these different indicators together, to actually go and start to crunch down into how we actually interrogate this data. What we actually need is a clear-cut process. What we need is a methodology in which we can compartmentalize this data, start to sift through it, and then start to create some tangible metrics and outputs from it. So we go through a data collection analysis phase, getting those terabytes and zettabytes of data together, to looking at how we're actually going to go and interrogate this, looking at our stakeholder engagement, looking at our visioning, our benchmarking, and then actually how we're going to implement this down, which is something that Thanos will cover later on. And then it's down to local implementation. How are we actually going to make meaningful differences and meaningful outcomes to how we go and implement and analyze this data? To understand how this can be done and how we can start to create calm in the chaos, and we look at data filtration. From this matrix, we can see here how we've clearly identified the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and then different policies, different elements that start to bring together all of these metrics. These 1,000 indicators, plus the local and national policies for a country, have been converted into a simple matrix so we can clearly demonstrate to stakeholders, to decision makers, and the local community how we're actually going to make a tangible difference and a tangible outcome. And then nice, clear Power BI metrics and outputs to measure our sustainable development goals. How are we performing? Where are we improving? Where we do need to improve? This level of data filtration allows us to demonstrate clear messaging. And then we can start to leverage this data. Then we can start to inform where do we need urban master planning? What does it need to achieve? And really start to underpin our decisions with agnostic, apolitical, unemotional data that will reinforce that decision-making process. To look at how we can actually implement this, we take a simple complex of food. Looking at these United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, we have 7 indicators, 7 metrics where we're looking to improve food resilience. So we're looking at how we go and address the social cohesion, how we go and address those areas that are more socially impacted, how we address food prices, how we ensure sustainable food production. We're looking at logistics, we're looking at the quality of land, different elements underpinning these SDGs so we can start to make a meaningful outcome and inform an urban master planning approach. Greater Muscat is a project that Candle had an absolute pleasure in taking part with. This was looking at Oman's capital city and looking at how we could go and make a huge difference working alongside the Omani government and the local municipality and regional leadership. It's something we've been very, very grateful for, and we've had a huge delight in being involved with our partners. Taking the approach of data analysis, we looked at the GIS data. This is the geospatial data to identify different areas. We see on the top left the food and food production areas, very localized, and we can see a large massing across there, versus the urbanization, the red areas, where we can see that urban massing along the coastline and a clear differentiation when the data is overlapped between the urban massing and the actual food production areas. We can also see there is quite a disparity between the urban massing and the amount of food production areas. A large amount of people reliant on a smaller landmass for food. So what we started to look at is how we could go and reinforce technology and reinforce and use those metrics to start to implement smart and vertical farming. We looked at how we could embed innovation and how we could leverage technology. We looked at how this would go and impact skills migration. The agricultural and farming industry is facing a challenge in terms of next generations taking on these skills. And we also looked at these challenges equally with technology and with agricultural investment. There are clear different investment routes to go and support both industries, but there is very little overlap between the two. We started to look at how this could be co-joined together so there is more overlap between those and it supports this technical approach to farming. And we looked at decarbonization and reutilizing the existing estate. How we could reuse those buildings that were underused, how we could look at implement vertical farming and starting to reduce the carbon effects of farming in there. And of course, with hydroponics, with smart farming approaches, they are more utilities intensive. We do use more water, we do use more light, we do use more power. How are we going to align all of those different utilities and those different demands to go and support this area and support our farming and support our resilience? So this is where we start to underpin this data. This is why we start to integrate the data into this process. And this really drives out a number of question marks with data. I used global footballing as an example. Global footballing is a hugely data-driven process and a hugely data-driven industry, whether it is for football predictions, for betting, for sports science, for different training metrics. Data has a huge part to play. And this is in a $3 billion industry. This has got a compound annual growth rate of 5%. It's a huge market and a huge global industry. All of this data is freely available. is merely clicks away to look at different players, to look at different social revenue distribution, and to look at even different social media analytics. All of this data is ever present. If we switch around to a smart city and the smart city industry, this is $100 billion industry, twice the compound annual growth rate, and has got a huge reliance on data and data interrogation. This data is much more siloed. This is where we can start to leverage the tools that we have, the different data analytic processes, and the tools that we've created through the smart city approach. This is where we can start to use the different overlapping data elements and start to really leverage that to inform urban master planning. And to reinforce how this can be done and the information we're sharing and the push that we're making into the industry, we have created a smart city framework for Oman that is now being implemented nationally, taking on the lessons learned from Muscat and also those key performance indicators. We're starting to work with the IMD Smart City Index and with the ITU, and this is already propelling the city and the country into the global market and into that spotlight and limelight after 2 years. This is a huge rate of development and a huge rate of growth, which we're proudly part of. And then what next? Next is to start to push this further, to break down those silos. We are looking to go and push that global guidance, that global advice, take those lessons learned, take that data analytics process, our bespoke tools that were created, and to really push into the industry. This is where we want to inform people that wrong is wrong, even if everyone is doing it. That we want to do things differently, that we want to make a big difference, and we can put a huge part to play in urban master planning and break down those silos. And now on to my colleague Thanos to talk about flooding.
Thank you, Stephen. And now we are going to talk about flood, how flood affects UN SDGs, and how do we measure it in the context of urban master planning. But first, why flood? Flood is the most common natural disaster worldwide. About 1.5 billion people live in vulnerable areas, a number which is estimated to rise by 24% in a 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming scenario. And on top of that, the annual flood damages are estimated to 120 billion US dollars, and that's only when you account property damage. And it's not just that, it's happening. Big highlights of April news were the deadly Dubai floods. Floods that happen in one of the most super arid regions across the world. And for a lot of people who have not worked in this area, they were shocked that it can happen even in these areas. But is that a trend, or is it just an isolated event? If we take a step back and look what's happening in the Middle Eastern area, we will soon realize that the Dubai floods last April was just one piece in the bigger puzzle. The Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iran, Pakistan, Oman, all of these countries have been badly affected in the recent years by devastating floods. Our case study area in Muscat was badly affected, severely affected by the supercyclonic storm, tropical storm of Gonu in June 2007. And another one start to just keep for a bit later is the October 2022 floods, devastating floods in Pakistan, resulting in $14.8 billion in damages and displacing a lot of people. Things we will cover in the next section. But if we take a step back, that's only the Middle East. But what's happening? What are the trends across the world? The latest IPCC report, the sixth assessment report, clustered groups across the world against climatic trends. And what we find out, all areas across the world will become hotter and particularly get wetter extremes, which means more flooding. But surely that, if it's a global event, it has a major impact against the UN SDGs. The two directly linked UN SDGs is number 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, and number 13, Climate Action. What both aim is to reduce the number of deaths and reduce the direct economic losses. And how we do it, it recommends countries to adopt and implement national disaster risk reduction strategies in line with the Sendai framework. So we can pick it up from what the Sendai framework says. So the target is clear: reduce disaster mortality, damage, and economic loss by 2030. And out of the 4 priorities, we start from number 1, understanding the risk. So risk is the key word. We will dive a little bit deeper. If you work in the risk analysis sector, you'll be familiar with the definition. It's a product of likelihood and the consequences. But how does that translate to flood risk? So in the context of flood risks, the likelihood is linked to the exposure of a land to flood, how frequently will it flood, and how badly. And the consequences is linked to the vulnerability. With vulnerability, we tend to link it in different factors, but for simplicity in the master planning, we link it with land use. So although the exposure, albeit the flood is a natural hazard, is driven by natural drivers, the overall flood risk is driven mostly by human factors. So what are the strategies to reduce that risk? Our main strategy in reducing the risk is to first lower our CO2 emissions, lower our human-induced impact on climate change, but the one that we have greater influence and more immediate impacts and results is to simply design better, put more vulnerable land uses at less exposed land. Because if we don't do it, images like this will be more frequent across the world. So how do we do it then? We just map it. Map is the most efficient tool in master planning. It's been said very clearly by the EU Floods Directive that countries are required to create and update flood hazard maps and flood risk maps. Maps like this, the EU Floods Directive driven the production of the flood maps for England or flood maps for the Republic of Ireland. Now, what I want to stand here is now with harnessing the modern technology, we don't just map, we create digital tools and centralized databases to develop these tools and provide this information freely available 24/7 to across the world, and to all people, stakeholders, and designers. But a map is not enough. Although it had to create a positive impact and effects to understand the risk and make measures, planning and implementation needs improvements. It's pivotal for the overall positive effect. So if we recap at this stage, what do we need in the master planning then? Well, we need flat maps. If we don't have them, we produce them. If we have them, then we focus on clear and strong policy frameworks. If there aren't, we produce one based on national, international policy frameworks. And then if we have them, we make sure they're implemented. And how do we do it then in a project, in a master plan project? We follow the data process that was outlined by Stephen in the previous section. We first collect data, analyze the study area, then review the results of our analysis, and to set up a direction and a communication with our stakeholders to build up a vision, and then set up a policy framework to support this vision. We provide guidance and action plans to make sure that the framework is implemented. Now let's go through each of these steps through our case study in Greater Muscat from the point of view of flooding. When we collected data, we realized that flood maps were not good enough for the level of study we're going to undertake. The last maps of 1992 had limited coverage, were outdated, didn't capture the latest changes in the urban landscape, and the 2018 flood map was too coarse. So what did we do? We didn't have them. We went and created them. We collected data across the contributing areas, 12 catchment drain areas, draining to Muscat over a large amount of area and carried out a flood modeling analysis to produce the flood maps. Now, for those who don't know what a flood model looks like, it looks like that. It's a dynamic hydrodynamic analysis of overland flow. It shows us where does it flood, where does water go, how deep it gets, and how fast it gets there. And all of these data that we produce is critical for doing a lot of post-processing analysis to inform our decisions. But first of all, it produces maps like this. A flood hazard map that shows us the exposure of our current assets. Another way of presenting and creating information is this map, which shows us the flood risk map. How risky is the flooding for people? The different classes in this area, in this picture, show how likely is the flood current to sweep away pedestrians, and can be used in applications such as civil protection and emergency plans. And something also to note is that these maps are not paper maps. They're not static. These are digital tools that can easily be extracted and dropped into other universally used platforms such as Google Earth. Other ways of representing this data is creating engaging animations like this one, when doing a spatial analysis against the 100-year floodplain and seeing which properties are within this floodplain. These tools can be used for communication, insurance purposes, design, and general master planning. But maps and these tools are just tools, and the purpose is to inform decision making. We use these tools to build a vision and set up a policy framework with guidance and, most importantly, action plans to ensure they're implemented and then picked up by the local authorities. So our challenge in master planning project is to translate what existing policies or international policies mean, what are the indicators mean in our study area, and then refine them, produce new, tailor-made for our project policies, set up science-based targets and measures to track progress, and harness the power of GIS tools to assist us in our risk decision making. And finally, just to show the direct impact of this process on this project, the flood maps we produced and communicate to our stakeholders were catalytic to the mood enhancement. The local authorities responsible for the national multi-hazard early warning system were alerted, understood the importance of upgrading it, and adopted the smart technology implementations of the system and deployed a mobile alert system for informing people for future water flooding, flash flooding, and tsunamis. And now I'm going to pass it to Dr. Elisabeth Marlow for the social migration.
Thank you, Thanos and Stephen, for outlining what data means to us. We have a situation with planning and uncontrolled planning. We want to avoid situations where people flee. There is no natural disaster. We know that in Pakistan, where we had 276% increase in rainfall, that 33 million people were displaced. That means 1.7 million homes were destroyed, but also 6 million people were placed in emergency with limited hazard warning systems. We've seen recently in the news, Brazil, 80,000 people to 150,000 people displaced. We know that climate change is happening. We've heard about flooding, but we also need to think about heat. From the map on the right, we can see that the summer predictions by the UN Habitat outline that the areas of greatest global population are at heat risk this summer. That's over 35 degrees. These are situations we need to start planning for because they're becoming too frequent. We know we're under pressure. We've got 81 billion people today on the planet, and this is going to increase to 9.7 million people by 2050. A further 1.4 billion by 2080. It's quite a lot of people. We know about our planetary boundaries, we know about Earth shortfall, and we can see that we've got a relationship with the planet and an ecological system that needs some consideration. The trends across the world outline to us that about 68% of the population by 2050 is going to be urban. People are moving from regions to come to cities. We know that the adaptation costs that are predicted by governments today are $160 to $300 billion by 2030. We know that 60% of these costs are going to increase by 60%, which takes that planetary bill to $565 billion by 2050. We've got to start reversing that trend a little bit. When we come to cities, we've heard about heat and flood risks. That's 2 out of the 10 natural drivers. But also, we live in a social environment. 8 out of 10 risks here are human and social related. It's getting quite expensive. How can we change the scenario? How can we start restoring and investing in opportunities and reducing risks? We've got to understand that we sit in a system, the ecological and social system. We start making decisions around planning and using risk-informed decision-making processes. We can do that. But to inform ourselves, we've got to look at data. We've got to understand what is a decision. For my own research, I looked at 39 frameworks that consider sustainability and resilience. 5 of them reviewed urban situations, and 3 of that 5 looked at cities. So if we've got 68% of the population come to cities, why are we not thinking about urban consequences more? This situation here is in Boston, where there's a lot more environmental data publicly available. What I like about it is this is the storm risk map. It's outlined to us that the city is at risk from storms, from rainfall, from flooding. It also maps real estate and where people live. When we look at where people live, we can understand who is at risk and where. This is bringing about how people are moving from one region to another or one neighbourhood to another because they know they're at risk. We can also review the situation, how to adapt to that. And we are in a position where we can look at national adaptation plans. We understand urban areas or master plans and buildings, and we can inform governance, policy and practice. We know that the risk landscape is going to change over time. We have to accept that. We have to make our decision-making processes with foresight. To do that, we've got to break some habits. We need to engage with the stakeholders as we did with Greater Muscat Plan. We need to maybe understand the social and economic situation the place we're working in. We can use climate change risk and flooding maps and data to inform those scenarios. And once we do that, we can start informing frameworks and understanding how the data gaps can inform our decision-making choices. We can build up urban strategies, hazard adaptation responses, and inform planning policy. We know that we can risk map and interpret that data and use it to inform our decisions. With the Greater Muscat Structural Plan, we used our information that we collected, our data of 1,000 indicators. We reviewed it thematically, and we brought about a sustainability assessment system. This allowed us to become accountable and set goals and boundaries to what we're looking at for the future of the 2040 population. We were able to build in net zero carbon pathways and also understand the climate hazard assessment process. As we went through stage 1, the data collection, that then informed the local assessment methodology. We brought out our understanding of how to develop policies and planning through each stage of the project, to the end where we're almost outlining how things can be quantified and qualified at an urban boundary level. To do that, we went through this process. we're able to review thematically and assess and filter that data, as Stephen talked about, use the ICP's climate scenarios and the UN development goals to inform our decision-making process. We can create action frameworks that are bespoke to the area that we're working in. What that ends up looking at, from a climate risk perspective, is we can come up with a strategy towards heat, flooding, and acting on emergencies. We're able to visualize what that meant in that area and outline what is at low risk and what is at high risk. And we understand the narrative of what each one of those super blocks means. We're able to plug the gap that we're finding ourselves. Once we map, we can see where we are and what we're designing with and what is in planning control and what is out of it and what is at risk. We can inform that to create frameworks and actions, as I've already outlined, around ecosystems, enhancing social value. Passive building design still has a role to play. We have to think about how people are going to afford their housing and afford the increased cooling loads that they're going to be facing in that global risk scenario. So that starts to bring about a scale of thought called community resilience planning, where we can start reviewing what is at risk and how to group assets together, maybe understand how people will engage with their community and where they can go to be safe and secure for a period of time of a hazard event. That process then can filter down into a master plan, a slightly smaller scale, and again, inform sustainability frameworks. And we can put goals and indicators and appropriate measurement to those scalar boundaries. We have some clear strategies informing our processes. We understand how to reduce heat stress. We definitely understand how to reduce the flooding impacts. And we're knowing and getting more informed about how to increase resilience of our social dynamic profiles and a community welfare and response. We have to prepare ourselves, and there's an opportunity there to do that once we're using risk-informed sustainable development processes. We need to do this. We have to prepare ourselves because it's starting to get expensive. There's a global bill getting higher and higher. So we've got to convert that cost into adaptation and invest that $1 now to save 23. Thank you for listening. I hope that was informative on where our processes can take us, how using decisions and using data to be informed leads us to making positive action.